Doug Oberhelman, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel. It's great to have you. You were the CEO and former chairman of the board of Caterpillar for a number of years. We can go over a little bit about your background and time with Caterpillar, but we really wanted to tap into some of the things you know. There's so many issues in the news these days when we talk about business, we talk about international trade, and you were in a position where you had to deal both with domestic operations as well as international operations. So you're one of the rare people that we can tap into and get your expertise and insights. So appreciate you joining us.
Great to be with you, Terry. And well, I certainly had a wonderful career at Caterpillar over 42 years, and I lived on, I guess, three continents and traveled to almost 70 countries, I think, as a total count. But I would say a lot of interesting experiences for sure over that 4 decades. But to watch the early 90s when I lived in Tokyo and see how China started to develop after it had been open, since the mid 70s with Richard Nixon and all of that. By the way, Caterpillar supplied the first standby power to that tent that they met in Beijing way back in those days. So it was really a lot of fun. But to see them really start to open up in the early 90s and the world start to trade with them and see what's happened to the world since then, some good and obviously some bad. It was a fascinating period to be in international business for sure.
Yeah, I remember that trip of Nixon's in early 1972. And, China back then was really a very poor nation. Now it's the second largest economy in the world. And we are having so many different troubles with them, political issues. I mean, I think anyone who's paying attention, obviously with the spy balloon that went over, with them stealing our technologies, and any number of other issues, now approaching also military operations in the South China Sea. In your estimation, should we continue dealing with China, or is it becoming where it's more trouble than it's worth?
I'll tell a little cute story first about my first trip there, Terry. In around 1990, 1991, I landed in Beijing, and there are at every intersection 10,000, 20,000 bicycles going through the streets. Very few automobiles. I was in a taxi, which happened to be a minivan, a Japanese minivan. There weren't really many, if any, Japanese-built cars at that time. But there were bicycles by the thousands everywhere you went. And of course, now you go to China, they're the leader in electric vehicles. There's no bicycles left anymore. And it's a totally modern, changed country in that 30-year period. It's just really unbelievable what's happened. But to get to your question, we absolutely have to find a way to deal with each other, trade with each other, talk to each other. You can't have the two largest competitors in anything disliking each other or worse. We've got to find a way to get through this. It is the largest economy, second largest economy in the world with the most people of any country. We need to trade with them. They need to trade with us. We also have to remember that we're 5% of the world's population on this little island of North America here. So we've got to find a way to sort through this, and they have great ambitions. We have great ambitions. I don't think we get there with not talking to each other at every level. I think we have to find a way to sort through the differences and recognize each other's strengths and weaknesses and be very guarded with them because they are trying to achieve dominance in the world. And certainly in 30 years, they've come from nothing to be a big competitor to the United States and Western Europe.
What's funny to me, it strikes me, China being communist, is that it seems as if the Chinese people, to make a generalization, are so entrepreneurial, so hardworking, and and they've grown this economy, and we see it both within mainland China. We see it on the island of Taiwan, that they're very aggressive people, smart people. So it's to their credit. And for a number of years, when we were dealing with China over the past, developing that relationship, the expectation, I think, in a lot of business circles, was that the more that they became capitalistic, which they did, as they kind of took away, moved away from what Mao was during his tenure. And they did create a great amount of wealth within China, as we see. But the expectation was that they would become more favorable to democracy. But now we see under Chairman Xi that he seems to be cracking back down, almost becoming Stalinistic. Did you know any of the leadership? I mean, to the extent that you worked with them, and what was your impression of them as leaders, and then how do you filter what you know with what's happening today?
Yeah, yeah. I've met personally, and I'm going to say the last four Chinese leaders, one-on-one in meetings and small group meetings. Every year we had a big forum in Beijing that they would all attend. I became fairly good friends with the last Prime Minister, Li Keqiang, who was really kind of a pro-business type person. And what happened here in retrospect is easy to see, and how it happened. Unfortunately, fortunately, it all started with World Trade Organization and China's ascension to that body in the early 2000s. We all thought that would really bring them into the world trading system, bring them in on a level playing field, bring them in on a set of rules and sort of values that we all knew in Western Europe and the members of the old GATT countries. And what happened with that was, as they grew, they sort of flouted WTO, as every country has done. The United States has done that too. WTO as an organization didn't have enough power to step up and correct that. And as a result, we have where we are now. Now, the other thing about China that I learned very quickly, they are aggressive, they are very entrepreneurial, they're very smart people, but they are used to sacrificing. And, going back to World War II, and long before that, the sacrifice the Chinese people did and made, that's what they grew up with. Scarcity of everything. And certainly they put policies in that were not good for them. The one-child policy is now the biggest demography debacle since Japan, and what's happening there. So they've got some real challenges coming up that they're going to have to overcome. But what we all forget in the West is, we all preach human rights and values, and we should, and we are the leading light in that, there's no question. But for the most part, the average Chinese citizen has benefited spectacularly under the opening of their economy, even though they don't enjoy the same rights we may enjoy. In their mind, they have tremendous rights. And we had, 20,000 employees in China when I was at Caterpillar. Great employees, hardworking people, and became very good friends with many of them. But it's a different set of values than we have in terms of where they came from. So we've got to remember that as we go forward. And I really get concerned when I see leaders of these two big countries at several levels not talking to each other, don't want to talk to each other. And that's how things happen. Accidents happen. And we have to really watch out about that. Now, I'm not thoroughly convinced that China has a militaristic motive here. They took over Hong Kong and never fired a shot. So they have an island right off their coast called Taiwan that's very close to China, that's pretty easy to surround. And I have my doubts militaristically that they would make a move, but we've got to keep an eye on that very closely. There's no question they and other countries, for a fact, are trying to steal our secrets. That's a fact of life, and we've got to guard against it. Again, I'll go back to the late 90s. We had a couple of young interns that we found shipping some of our secrets back to China. I'll never forget that our lawyer came in and said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to punish them to the fullest extent of the law. At which he said, the government would like us to keep it going so they can trace back where that's going. And this was 25 years ago. So we knew, eyes wide open, what's going on here. We all should, and keep a very close eye on that, because today the ability to spy and capture secrets is greater than ever in the world of technology. So it's really a delicate situation and requires a lot of delicate diplomacy. But I hope and really look to leaders to talk to each other so it doesn't get out of hand any more than it is.
I believe you said you had 20,000 employees in China, or
Yeah.
Chinese. How do you manage? Here you're headquartered in Peoria. How do you manage operations like that overseas? And to what extent did you find dealing with the Chinese workers any different than dealing with the American workers?
Well, Caterpillar's been an international company forever, and over half to 60% of its sales are always outside the United States. So we had a long history of working with non-Americans, working with everybody in Europe, South Americans, Southeast Asia, you name it, Australia. So we had a pretty good history of how to get along with other countries and their employees. And in China, it was pretty simple. We had something around 20 plus factories, and in every factory, we had a local Chinese manager managing that plant. In most cases, they had been to the United States, they'd worked here, they'd worked in our factories, they'd worked in our offices, they knew the Caterpillar system, and they went back and became leaders there. And I always found one-on-one relations and discussions with the Chinese. In fact, I find that with the Japanese, Brazilians, almost anywhere I've gone. I've just found that fascinating over my lifetime, and to recognize a different culture. But they wanted the same things we wanted. They wanted more money for their kids. They wanted a better set of better housing to live in. The same thing we're all after here. It's no different. But it's just a different system. And I was told one time by somebody in the know that you've got to remember that all those Chinese employees are members born into the Chinese Communist Party, which I thought was pretty good. And I do remember that, and I do know that, and I think we all should keep that in mind, because it's China first and Caterpillar second, and everything else third. But certainly it's a valuable resource. We were fortunate; it was a big market for Cat, but we didn't export much from China. We didn't import much to China, but what we built in China stayed in China for that market, and now we're top 2 or 3 makers over there. And there's lots of successful stories about American companies penetrating China. Same in Japan, same in Brazil and elsewhere. And that's one of the things that made the United States and America strong over the years, is trading through exports and trading with other countries.
Where do you, as a CEO of a major corporation, I think in America, am I right, that Caterpillar has in the neighborhood of something like 100,000 employees?
Worldwide, around 100,000. Yeah, maybe a little bit over that. Yeah, worldwide. I think about half, a little less than half are here. Half and half, Paul, I think is fair to say.
Which, in looking at that, I mean, I thought, here you are running an organization. It's a business, but you had more employees than the state of Illinois, than the governor has running the state of Illinois.
Yeah, well, that's right. It is a big company, but it was really fun. I thoroughly enjoyed my career. And Caterpillar, it's a big company, but it's relatively, it's construction equipment and power equipment, and it was just really a lot of fun and a close-knit group, and I thoroughly enjoyed that, and very successful over almost 100 years now.
Was it like in the neighborhood of 30 or 35 years you were with Caterpillar before you became the CEO, something like that?
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And you mentioned you lived in a number of different countries. How much, I mean, you had, I think, a background in finance in college, and you went when you joined the company. But how much did living overseas prepare you for then ultimately becoming the CEO, as we talk about, having operations in different nations?
Yeah, I think without a doubt that international experience gave me something that I never could imagine I would receive, undergo. and then apply it. I remember my first foreign assignment was down in South America, Southern Cone. I went down there basically to repossess Caterpillar machines after the great petrodollar recycling of the late 70s, the Mexican peso bomb of 1981, of 1979, and then we watched all those currencies devalue through Latin America until 1981 when I got to Montevideo, Uruguay. Argentina at that time was in my territory, and in 1979, Caterpillar sold 1,200 machines in Argentina, new machines from the factory, mostly from Brazil and the United States. I lived there 3 years, and we sold 4 new machines and repossessed several hundred. So it was the reverse thing going on, and that's kind of how I cut my teeth. You got to remember, when I was in college, I'm old. I was in college. The gold standard was released. I was in college. The dollar was floating. We had currencies, and one of my early jobs before I moved to South America was trading foreign currencies: the UK pound, the German Deutschmark, the French franc, the Swiss franc. Those are all gone today with the euro. So that's how I learned business, was one, in college studying, and then two, experiencing it the first few years, obviously in a very different environment than we had today, and very little development in the world. At that time, it was the United States and Western Europe, and not much else. And boy, today, the rest of the world has caught up. If you look at what's happened in the world in our lifetime, Terry, the number of people, 7 billion people on the planet that have been lifted out of poverty, it's phenomenal. There's never been a period of growth of income and wealth building like that. So it's been good for everybody, but boy, is it challenging to manage through that, obviously. And today it's probably more challenging than ever. And kind of happy I'm retired and being able to watch and read about all this, actually.
You know, it's you're talking. We were talking about China, and you talk about the development since Nixon was there just a little over 50 years ago when he opened the door to China. I had worked with a woman when I was in Washington who grew up in Shanghai, and when we were working together, she went back to Shanghai, and when she returned, I asked her about her trip. She said, "It's changed so much that I couldn't recognize the block that I grew up on." Because they had been living in basically little shacks, and that block then was replaced with high-rise apartments. So it's just completely been transformed.
Well, I can tell you two things that stick in my mind. Well, there's many, but one, that Pudong area across from Shanghai. When I first started going there, that was basically a swamp, a marsh, a delta. And today it's 30, and we took a tour because we were going to build a factory out there. And we took a tour. We drove, I don't know, 10, 15 miles before we got to our plant site, and they said this is all going to be developed. Well, you know, when I went back there some point in time after I was CEO, I went down that same road. I didn't recognize anything to get to our plant. Sure enough, there was our plant in the middle of all this development. It was phenomenal. Another one I remember so well is Dubai. Same thing. Going out in that desert and seeing the stakes. They were telling us where all this development was going to go. They were using all these tractors. And 5 years later, you didn't recognize anything because it was all massively developed. And that's been going on around the world. It's been good for Caterpillar. It's been good for Americans. And certainly world economic growth is good for everybody. But these tensions that come up have to be managed. And we as leaders, I'm saying we, but certainly Americans and the Indians and the Chinese and Western Europeans have to find a way to communicate with each other and make sure everybody's population is enjoying the growth. Otherwise, it gets out of kilter and bad things happen, as we've seen many times. And it's a dangerous period right now, Terry, to tell you the truth.
It is. And then on the other hand, as we said, the nations of the world have become wealthier. I remember, I mean, we're in somewhat the same age group. Again, how China used to be desperately poor. I can remember the old magazines, coverage, like Look or Life magazine on India, and they had pictures of people literally dead in the streets from starvation. Now, India is a thriving economy. It's expanding greatly. In fact, let's just, I mean, I could talk to you for hours, but maybe we can do this again on some other issues, because I think there's so many issues that are always impacting the world, and it would be great to tap into your expertise. But just this week, we had the Prime Minister of India visiting here, Modi. Did you deal with India? And when we look at China and we look at India, there are great population problems with China, as you touched on. India, on the other hand, I think has already surpassed China in terms of population. If you were still the CEO, or just your view, where should America be looking business-wise for greater opportunities?
In fact, I met President Modi soon after he was named some years ago, and I was impressed with him. I know there's a lot of controversy surrounding human rights in India, and we've got to talk about that, but he's really, I think, pushed India to step up to China-like level of performance. There's a long way to go. It is the largest democracy in the world today, more people than obviously China. They've got a long way to go. There's horrible bureaucracy there that gets in the way of things, but they're chipping away at that. And I think everybody today is looking to broaden their supply chains. The solely dependent supply coming from China is just not viable anymore, and nor would it be from any single country for that matter. You look at Taiwan for microchips today. That's going to change rapidly in the next 3 to 5 years because it's too much of a risk to have all the eggs in one basket of any country. So you're going to see that wealth and those initiatives go kind of all over the world. Vietnam's certainly been a big recipient of growth out of China and growth in Southeast Asia. 70 million people that I think are probably advancing faster than any country ever has, and it's kind of a hidden fact, but it's really done well among a couple of other countries over there. So we're going to see that in the future, and I think we'll also benefit from some reshoring to the United States here, and we're seeing some of that today. There's some inherent challenges we have here, and maybe we can take that up on another day with why we couldn't get all of our jobs back and take over all of the manufacturing out there, but certainly some of that's going to come back here to our benefit.
When I had a printing business, there were things I could do internally very well, and there were other things like business cards I didn't want to mess with. So if I got a business card order, I'd send it out to an outside vendor. I kind of use that as my own motto when I look at the world. There are jobs that we have in the world that are low-skilled labor jobs. They're never going to be able to make very much money, and maybe those are the things that should be done in an India or a Vietnam or wherever, those developing nations. And the American lifestyle, we can afford to have the lifestyle we have as long as we maintain the high skill and high performance parts of the global economy. And I think that's where you were managing that and having to make those decisions on an ongoing basis.
That's right, Terry. I often use the analogy of the guy back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the blacksmith. Saw the first automobile go by, didn't think a thing about it. 20 years later, he's out of a job.
Yeah. It's
incumbent on us as Americans to make sure we're as productive as we can be, that we're as educated as we can be, and we can do another whole discussion on education,
right,
which has deteriorated greatly during our lifetime at great risk to this economy and this country. But that's another subject. And we've just got to make those kind of investments here to keep us at the forefront. AI is coming. We ought to own that. That will only mean productivity and more jobs and wealth for our country. We can keep ahead of others. So those are the kinds of things, and it's not unlike a company. You've got to stay ahead of the competition. A country has to stay ahead of the competition, doing smart things and investing wisely.
I think people casually look at someone who's a CEO. We have people talking about the corporations, and they tend not to look below the surface. So to have someone with your knowledge, and I think this is educational for me, but also for our viewers, when we talk about these issues, and for someone with your background, who, as we are dealing with both international trade and as we talked about China and the problems associated with that and associated with the supply chains, these are all issues that we appreciate you sharing your worldly and wealth of experience that you have with us. Doug, if we can, we'll we'll wrap up now, but look forward, if we can, to dig into some of these other issues on an ongoing basis.
Great, Terry. We will. Thanks. And I was very lucky with my career and loved it and really enjoyed it. It's been fascinating to watch what's happened to the world, in my working lifetime of over 40 years. So nice being with you, and good luck to you. And thank you for doing this.
Thanks so much.